Very self-conscious this morning, running around with too much to do, not being very good about my manners. Good morning. Well, I thought a lot about the relation between morals and manners when I was working on this, and I decided basically that I don't think they're that different. That's one of the conclusions I'm going to come to. When trying to figure out how we act amongst each other, manners and morals can both be used to help us behave better, to live better lives, more ethical lives, and they can also be used to berate and punish and control other people. I also think, these days in particular, that manners are too often excluded. Quite often we sort of think of manners as something that we just let go, they get in the way. I think good manners are both very useful for honoring the inherent worth of every individual and for nurturing our own innate compassion. That's my conclusion today. That's where I'm getting to, and I hope what I say will add to that. I think ethical humanists should practice good manners. So, good luck. When I first thought this up, though, I felt I was pining for the good old days and channeling my inner grumpy man, right? Sort of, why don't the kids these days? Looking at entertainment industry, particularly in comedy, it strikes me how much is irreverent. There's so much crude, loud, and demeaning entertainment. Television and movies are filled with characters who seem to get their social status, their ego, boosted by being rude, pure and simple. Bart Simpson, who at least has a sentimental side, was the first in my memory. But South Park kids, I know many of you like them. I think they're just mean-spirited. But you see this even more and more and more. Mocking, degrading behavior. It's always been a part of our lives, for sure. I mean, for young people trying to navigate the competitive social world, the junior high hallway is a dangerous place to be. There's the cutting comment, the put down, the cruel laughter. But today, with social media, it is so much more easy to lead to this sort of mocking behavior. And studies are showing that it's increasing rates of depression among our young people, and even suicide is sometimes linked to this. And so we have campaigns and legislation out in the world against bullying. Cyberbullying is particularly brutal. Less dramatically, a lot of people do talk about how they feel like manners are becoming less a part of our lives, basically deteriorating etiquette, from simply not returning phone calls to not giving RSVPs. How many of you have had people not respond to your invitations recently? Oh, you live in a very mannerful group. Good. I'm glad for you. Better than for me. Community organizers have told me this. Wedding planners have said things have changed. And if you're ever trying to organize something on Meetup, I mean, quite often only 30% or 40% of the people that sign up on Meetup actually show up. The leader of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County, my mentor, Joe Schumann, has written about this, and he was very frustrated. He's a very rationalistic person and doesn't get when people don't respond to the basic cues. He says, I call and they don't answer. This is an essay he wrote. I call a second time and ditto. A long silence trailing off into infinity. Written correspondence is no better. Most likely it's tossed into the same bin with the supermarket flyers and car wash promos. Bewilderment, frustration, anger. I'm caught between wanting my event to succeed and placing responsibility where it belongs. Often I succumb to the former. So I take the effort to do a follow-up call, and I ask, am I offering a supportive and welcoming reminder to a friend flooded with life's incessant demands? Or am I simply a pest? Perhaps I'm being condescending, treating an adult who should be responsible like a negligent child. Unlike the recent past, the obligation to respond is no longer upon the recipient. He goes beyond this and begins to draw broader conclusions. See if you agree with him. He says, more is at risk than etiquette. The issue is weightier than the bruises inflicted by on the microcosms of everyday relations. The social compact is at stake. Society is held together by the assumption of reciprocity. I say good morning to you, and you respond with a good morning of your own. Hello, goodbye. You ask me a question, and I feel compelled to answer. Such reciprocity is the implied anthropological dynamic on which we all depend for a meaningful and productive social life. When calls go unanswered and the loop remains open, we're headed for greater isolation and social breakdown. Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, reminds me of this as well. Is this a trend that's actually happening, and is it leading to a greater deterioration of social civility? Some people say it's even leading to a breakdown of law and order. Is that because we're not practicing good manners? One of my favorite quotes about this is the philosopher Edmund Burke, who talked about etiquette as being fundamental to our ethical character. This is a quote he said that I had on my wall for years. He says, manners are of utmost importance, more importance than laws. Manners are what vex or soothe, corrupt or purify, exalt or debase, barbarize or refine us by a constant, steady, uniform, insensible operation, like that of the air we breathe. I agree. Almost invisibly, manners mold us. But Burke's claim, I think, raises another question. Which manners soothe, purify, exalt, and refine us? Which manners vex, corrupt, debase, and barbarize? Were things really better in the good old days? Were times better because people had better manners? Well, I went back and took a look at a part of the world where manners were so refined and extreme, the court of Versailles in the 18th century. Now there's the term etiquette is from the French, and it became central, and it's described as, quote, a code of behavior that delineates expectations for social behavior, according to contemporary conventional norms within a society, social class, or a group. The word actually in French means tag or label, and one of the worst things that could happen to you in French society was to be labeled ill-mannered. Louis XIV really oversaw an incredibly brutal, competitive etiquette competition in the court. Careers and social advancement would determine on whether you had good manners or not, or people knew that. Even leaders in small towns gained access to power because they had good manners. Local tax collectors were actually known to berate those people of lower classes just to show their social status. It was so ingrained in that society. Rank was everything, and every aspect of the court was determined by it, and it was the king who determined your rank. It's called Ridicule. Did anybody see it? It's a French language film, Ridicule, about this absurdity, this decadent aristocratic class and the manners that they used at Versailles. And it involved witty repartee and humor in the right way. Puns were not considered good manners. But superficially dedicated themselves to these manners at such an incredible rate that it sort of masked this humiliation culture, if you will. There was an example at the very beginning of the film. It's pretty brutal. Actually, there's a young person who's obviously been spurned by an older person. And the older person is so infirm that they're virtually paralyzed. And they die of a heart attack after this young person comes in and in private urinates on them. This is the sort of humiliation that the court got into. In another scene, one poor old sap woke up to find somebody had stolen one of his shoes. And it was such ill-mannered to not be dressed properly that he ran into the court and hung himself. Now this is a film, but things like this did happen. It was such an extreme of etiquette. As the bourgeoisie began to rise in France, people began to want manners if you talk to them because they were unprepared for high societies and they demanded sort of a trainer's manual. And thanks to a gentleman named Antoine de Courtin in 1672, they got one. They got this manual. The Catholic Church was producing manuals on good manners and etiquette, and they were gobbled up by this increasingly growing middle class that wanted to climb the social ladder. And they were weirdly oppressive manners that were being promoted at the time. They went to England. The Earl of Chesterfield thought that he was doing his son a favor when he published 400 letters of fatherly advice to his son about etiquette. And in this collection was certain things that seemed to just squeeze the joy out of life, as if that was the goal. Here's a lovely little part of this book. This was written in 1748 to his son. I wish heartily that you may often be seen to smile, but never to laugh while you are alive. Frequent and loud laughter is a characteristic of folly and ill manners. It is the manner in which the mob express their silly joy at silly things, and they call it being merry. In my mind, there's nothing so illiberal and so ill-bred as audible laughter. Loosen up, Dad. Wow. You all laugh. Terrible. No. This was in England before Monty Python, right? My favorite Monty Python sketch is actually one that took place supposedly in 1895, where you have Oscar Wilde, James McNeill Whistler, and George Bernard Shaw trying to impress the Prince of Edward. And in this, I won't go into it, Google it, but each of them is competing to try to be seen as the most witty of the party, a charming sort of bon vivant. Because in a lot of ways, in British society, Lord Shaftesbury, for example, about 100 years earlier, wrote that politeness was, quote, the art of being pleasing in company. So periodicals, there was one called The Spectator, which was created, this was on their masthead, created in order to enliven morality and wit, and to temper wit with morality, to bring philosophy out of closets, libraries, schools, and colleges, to dwell in clubs, and assemblies, and tea tables, and coffee houses. So readers hoped that these manuals would be telling them what conversation topics would make them wanted at parties. This was very important, and as aristocracy began to give way to democracy, more and more the middle class began to want this. And in America, even so, with lots of new immigrants, they wanted to fit in and move up the ladder, and they turned to which great American etiquette mistress? Anybody know? Emily Post. I didn't know as much. My wife is a Miss Manners reader, but Emily Post was one of the most powerful and profitable mistress of manners. She was born in Baltimore in 1872 in a world of carefully delineated rituals, from sort of cotillion dance etiquette to proper dress. And she went to Miss Graham's finishing school in New York State, where she was reportedly, quote, tall, pretty, and spoiled. After a wedding and 2 sons and a divorce, she began writing for magazines about interior design and architecture, and soon after began to do humorous travel books. And in 1922, when she turned 50, her career took off when she published Etiquette in Society, Business, Politics, and at Home. And this book became sort of the Bible of etiquette. She was writing daily columns, and by 1950, Pageant magazine named her the second most powerful woman in America, only second to Eleanor Roosevelt. Very good, very good. She had a family business, an empire really. The Emily Post Institute was run by her daughter. Her great-great-granddaughter, Anna, is the family wedding expert. She published a book recently called Do I Have to Wear White? Emily Post Answers America's Top Wedding Questions. Run out and get that. Her great-great-grandson is co-author of the 18th edition of the Emily Post Etiquette book, and he's co-host of a podcast called Awesome Etiquette. This is an empire, and it's well alive today. It tells you how to defriend people on Facebook, or which armrest to use in an airplane. I didn't know there was an appropriate one. Maybe it makes sense that Post's background was in architecture and interior design, because in some ways, manners are about the order of social interchange between people. Perhaps that's the way we order our social world, so we're more fluid and effective. Businesses certainly pay a lot of money to try to teach people manners of foreign cultures, whether you're in New York socialite circles or in global boardrooms. People are always searching for ways to get ahead, and manners are a way you can do that. Now, there is an evolutionary explanation given. You can find almost any explanation for any topic in this world, but there is, because Darwin studied facial expressions. He was very into it, and disgust and approval were two that he talked about. And many people talk about how this is something that helps us with our manners. Val Curtis, who's the director of the Hygiene Center in London, talks about how facial expressions is connected to issues of hygiene. And then he suggested that our ability to recognize social cues like disgust and approval help cue us to things that prevent diseases with our children and with each other. Others suggest that the ability to distinguish cultural signs and manners help you distinguish who is inside your culture and who is outside the culture. So survival is sort of enhanced when you can tell who is a stranger that might be a threat and who is an insider. So this becomes what's called socially local adaptive behavior as an evolutionary element. In some cultures around the world, for example, mutual grooming is fully accepted and important for health, like picking nits. or hunting for head lice is very common in indigenous cultures and not out of the ordinary. And it's for health reasons. But obviously in our culture, I don't know how you feel if you went down Rittenhouse Square and saw people picking their head scalps, each other's scalps. Would you feel disgust? Would you give them that signal that that's not what we do here? So then there's the argument, we hear from anthropologists and sociologists, that, look, all morals and manners are relative. They're relative to time and place. Harriet Martineau published How to Observe Morals and Manners in 1838, and she suggested cultural relativism. It's just relative to time and place. Emily Durkheim, many of you know, considered his study basically the manners of acting, thinking, and feeling external to the individual, which are invested with a coercive power by virtue of which they exercise control over him. So social displays of disgust, for example, indicate socially unacceptable behavior and control people in that way. One of Durkheim's proteges explains that manners protect cosmologies, and that serves the upper class who rely on that, whether they're priestly class or other people in power. Now, anthropology, sociology, Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, you can look at any of them, they all were really, anthropology took off when we began to find out more about various civilizations around the world and various cultures that were to this point unknown. And cultural relativism grew and grew and grew at this time. Now, it's not that it never existed. The Greeks believed in cultural relativism. There was a fight between the sophists, for example, who were the wise people who taught the wealthy of Athens. And they basically believed that, look, manners and morals are nothing more than powerful tools that you use. And there's nothing objective to them. On the other side of this argument were people like Plato and Aristotle who said, no, there are objective manners and morals, and they need to be defended. So Plato talks about justice or goodness being the eternal ethical goodnesses that manners come from. Aristotle talks about how there are these elements of usefulness to people who want to use them and that they are practiced and you teach them to your kids. All of these are, I think, part of the issues that I take with people who try to distinguish manners and morals. And I'm thinking, what's the difference between the two? Peter Johnson wrote a book called The Philosophy of Manners, in which he called manners the little virtues. I like that term. And he said they represent mutual expectations about what's right and wrong. 150 years earlier, Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote the famous Vindication for the Rights of Woman, said that, look, manners can be something that drifts away from morality, and that gets dangerous. She says, manners and morals are so nearly aligned that they've often been confounded into one. But though the former should only be a natural reflection of the latter, in other words, manners should just be a reflection of our morals, when the various causes produce corrupt manners, which are clearly caught early, morality becomes an empty name. What she means by that is that manners and customs, which perhaps originally grew out of morals, end up eclipsing morality. So it doesn't matter that people are being violated in the courts of Versailles. What matters are these manners, which basically mean nothing at all. The most common response to the claim that both manners and morality is relative, as I said, was given by people who say no, there are certain objective standards to both morals and morality. I remember when I was an adolescent, probably about 17 or 18, I wrote the book, the series Dune, Frank Herbert, I think. And there's a wonderful example of how people might want to say, no, manners and morals actually are tied together and they're not so different. Imagine if I was walking up to you in Rittenhouse Square and you raised your hand to shake my hand, and right before I got there I went, spin my hand and shook your hand. Would you register disgust? Yeah, probably. Well, if you came from the planet Dune, you wouldn't, because you would know that on Dune, water is so precious that by spitting in my hand, I was wasting a precious resource that could save my life, and I was honoring you by that. So that's an example where people say, look, manners may look different on the outside, but underneath the morality is the same. It's respect in the inherent worth of other people, basic respect for each person. That may be true. But not all differences in culture are the base of a misunderstanding of basic values. There are times when basic values conflict. And so I don't like necessarily assuming that all of these differences are just relative differences of time and place. I mean, there's a fundamental difference of values between For example, people who fly planes into buildings and those who are the victims, right? Those people who actually do things in the here and now that violate and hurt and abuse people for some other world, some afterlife, is very different fundamental moral framework, and I don't think you can square those by saying this is just a difference in manners. That's a whole nother avenue to go. Let me return to manners as I get towards my conclusion. For me, manners are important as part of our commitment in ethical humanism to deed before creed. To deed before creed. My manners, as I express them to you or to others, are more important than the manners I preach. So that's very important, and I think sometimes in Versailles that was forgotten. I want to act in ways that soothe and purify and exalt and refine us. I want my children to do the same. I want them to have good manners and good morals in their action. And that's where I think the distinction is not so great. It's how you act towards people. Now, from my perspective in ethical humanism, especially from a parent who did not encourage his children to watch South Park, I think that one of the most effective ways to teach manners is to instill in my kids an appreciation for the inherent worth of other people and to just nurture their natural compassion. I think in them are the keys to both morals and manners. It's already there. Circumstances greatly affect how we express our morals, but I think it's less constructive to look at all the different codes than to go to what is behind most of the etiquette frameworks in our world. When I was at my best as a parent, I didn't emphasize a list of commandments. I didn't check off the various codes of etiquette that they should do. The compassion in their hearts and the awareness of other people in the world is what made the biggest difference for me. And I think ethical culture Sunday schools did that for my kids. That's our approach. And rather than scolding for children for their basic selfish impulses that we all have, we try to, what I like to say, water the seeds we want to grow. We pay attention to their compassion. We pay attention to their awareness of other people. And I like the gardening analogy, because in gardening, I think there are certain elements that are very similar to teaching manners and morality. Certainly, the soil and the environment have a big effect on whether or not manners and morality and plants grow. But gardening, like parenting, requires patience, hard work. It can be very deeply humbling because you don't have final control over the fruit or flower that grows in your garden. You do your best, but you don't have final control. Gardening, I also think, offers a middle path between control and freedom, hope and acceptance, respectability and respect and responsibility to a degree. So, in a way, when you garden and when you parent, you know you're not in full control, but you do the best you can. Because gardening and parenting or teaching is about a relationship. It's about two people. A gardener does not leave nature to grow wild, and a parent does not abdicate responsibility for guiding our children. So this goes back to manners. My wife, who not coincidentally is the gardener in our house, was the one who really helped me understand the importance of manners. I was kind of like, it doesn't matter, don't hassle about it, whatever. But she reminds me that a well-prepared guest room, quickly responded to RSVPs, sending birthday cards, writing thank you notes are important. They're small rituals, but in Burke's words, they're rituals that are the constant, steady, uniform, insensible operations like the air we breathe in that builds our character and builds relationships. That's why, as a parent, I appreciate manners as little virtues that I hope my children would adopt. And there are times that others would say to me, why do you force your kids to say thank you when they don't really feel thankful? Thank you. Right? Why make them write thank you notes with insincere explanations about how much they love the fuzzy bunny slippers that Aunt Clara sent them? Right? But I think that this is something that Aristotle taught us. You learn manners and morals by practicing them, even when you don't necessarily believe them when you're very young. One professor and humanist, Goldwyn Emerson, put it this way. He said, for children, it may not be apparent why it is good to say please and thank you. But Aristotle and Dewey would say it's important from the habit of doing so. Learning the habit of behaving is important to reinforce the reasons to do so when the child is old enough to reason clearly. Later, young adults will come to realize why their parents and teachers urge them to get into the habit of practicing good manners. So by guiding children in good manners, whether it's at home or in ethical society, Sunday schools, I think there are three important lessons that are taught. First, you are born into a web of social obligations that you don't necessarily choose. Second, discipline's necessary to recognize those relationships and not just be totally self-absorbed. And third, that every person believes in inherent worth and deserves basic respect. So there's a web of relationships. You have to be disciplined to keep your mind about that so that you express your belief in the worth and value of individuals. And in my parenting life, I hope that I do this in a humbling fashion. I don't try to control or humiliate like the court of Louis XIV. It would be easier to become more etiquetteful than thou. But I don't want to turn it into a game or a competition. I hope my parenting brought out the best in my kids and in myself, and I hope that when we all practice it together, it does the same for both of us. I hope that the inherent worth is what is conveyed in those manners. Not keeping on superficial self-esteem that you do that spoils a child, but a deep sense of respect that say, I see you, I value you, I want to learn from you. It's an opening to a relationship. It's so easy to find fault in others. It's so easy to feed our own need for self-importance. It's no wonder that etiquette evolved into some bizarre ritual of one-upsmanship in many cultures. While I don't want to take all of the advice of this first modern humanist, Erasmus wrote in 1530 in a book called On Good Manners for Boys. He advised young children about the perils of fidgeting, yawning, bickering, and scratching. But he counsels that they should, quote, readily ignore the faults of others, but avoid falling short yourself. So I think that's an important element to remember when we teach manners, is not to get on our pedestal so much. I think morals and manners are not that different from each other. They can become weapons of abuse and control, or they can help us be better people. But they're too overly overlooked. Manners are too overly overlooked. I hope that the manners I try to instill in myself, my family, and others help honor the inherent worth of individuals, nurture our own compassion, so that we can all soothe, purify, exalt, and refine us all. Thank you very much.